With the recent explosion of Meta glasses, this seems like exactly the right time to tackle the issue at the heart of today's episode. Covert filming in public places, filming in private spaces, got a lot easier when cameras began to get smaller. What was once the stuff of spy thrillers is now being sold at retailers for a mere few $100s. I recognize that there are some safety features that are built in, right? There are blinking lights to indicate that someone is recording, but I'm not entirely confident that that's going to help in spaces like locker rooms or anywhere else where you might be more than a few feet away from the glasses. Or in skiffs reviewing documents solo, or in medical examinations. Of course, the issue of hidden cameras predates the miniaturization that enabled Meta glasses. In fact, it's prompted an entire genre of social media consisting of people searching hotels, Airbnbs, and other spaces for hidden cameras and false mirrors. To go even more retro, there are a series of civil cases addressing hotel liability when two-way mirrors are discovered that allow peeping Toms to peer into bedrooms while guests get their freak on. But today's case takes us out of the bedroom and into the bathroom. This is Conduct Unbecoming. I'm Erin, and I'm your host. I think you can probably guess from the intro today that this case is not all that unique. In fact, when I was trying to find out more information about Sergeant Major Joshua Prescott, I found I had to keep switching back and forth between the tabs with my original article and my tabs with my new search results, because there were other soldiers who got into hot water recording people without their consent. One case revolved around a soldier who had consensual sex with women, but recorded the act without their consent and uploaded the resulting videos to OnlyFans. Another dealt with a man who committed similar acts but with minors. Stick around after the main case to hear about an incident that I'd argue was much more high profile, or should have been, but that I also didn't hear about until I began researching for this episode. Prescott Manor doesn't have an appellate history just yet, and frankly, it'll be some time before the Army Court of Criminal Appeals hands down any opinion they may write. I, however, have lots of opinions, and what is a podcast but a place for me to share those? During the hot and muggy Alabama summer, which I like to picture as constantly having cicadas even though I know they're seasonal, someone dialed up the Enterprise Police Department with information. They said that Sergeant Major Prescott was a big creep that hid cameras in his home and recorded women when they used the bathroom. Whether that was using the bathroom as a bathroom or as a changing room or as a shower. And, as the caller alleged, it wasn't just adult women. The fact that a minor was recorded seemed to be the whistleblower's tipping point, but it does raise some questions, and my eyebrows, around who knew Prescott was recording and for how long they knew that information. I'd estimate that Sergeant Major Prescott had been in the Army for about 20 years when the call came into the switchboard at Enterprise PD. But that's a rough estimation based on the fact that he was 41 years old when the allegations surfaced. It doesn't account for all the possible paths that he took to arrive at that spot at that point in his life. But given that lengthy tenure, he'd led soldiers and he'd worked his way up into a position of power, of leadership, and of trust. He was someone soldiers and their families looked up to and turned to for guidance. In fact, in July 2024, when that call came in, Prescott was the senior enlisted leader for Fort Novostel's 1st Battalion, 223rd Aviation Regiment. His battalion primarily trained pilots to fly the CH-47 Chinook. After receiving the call, Enterprise PD reached out to the Army Criminal Investigation Division, and they assembled like the Avengers and began investigating. They discovered that Prescott concealed a camera in a guest bathroom at his home and that it had been capturing images for quite some time. He was initially arrested by the Enterprise Police Department and charged in the civilian court with possession of child sexual abuse materials. If convicted of possession under Alabama law, Prescott would face a maximum sentence of 10 years. If convicted for production of child sexual abuse materials, Prescott was looking at a maximum of 20 years. But under the Army's laws, production of child sexual abuse materials could result in up to 30 years of confinement. Apropos of almost nothing, I think Prescott's is the smiliest mugshot I've seen for a sex crime. I'll post it over on the podcast Instagram page, Conduct Unbecoming. And that Instagram is always linked in the show notes. As the investigation continued and wound deeper, it revealed that while Prescott was assigned to a fort in Colorado, he'd also used his cell phone to secretly film a woman who was showering at his house. In fact, that voyeurism dated back at least 14 years, and his little stash contained hundreds of videos from that decade-and-a-half-long period. In those 14 years, he'd worked at Joint Base Langley Eustis in Virginia, Fort Carson in Colorado, and Fort Bliss, Texas. In episode 82, The Adams Case, I mentioned that the prevailing trend was towards extending the statute of limitations on sex crimes, but that Adams got kind of a weird ameliorative benefit that I certainly wouldn't have expected from a change in the UCMJ. And Prescott, here, was also saved by the statute of limitations. Due to how old some of his recordings were, prosecutors couldn't pursue charges for all of them. And I know that means that he couldn't be prosecuted for everything that investigators uncovered, but even by my sketchy math, Prescott was recording intimate images of people without their consent for approximately 75% of his career. For 75% of his career, the Army was using your tax dollars to move him from fort to fort, duty assignment to duty assignment, expanding his victim pool each time. I don't imagine that it was particularly fun to unpick his movements across the bases, notifying victims and potential victims of what happened. And something else for us to point out here is that coverage of this case describes Prescott as secretly recording female guests to his home. Presumably, there were also men using his guest bathroom. If footage of men wasn't uncovered, I'm extrapolating and presuming that Prescott either didn't trigger the recording when men went into the restroom, or any footage of men that came about was deleted. Which, if you extend that logic one step further, would seem to suggest that he either intentionally created or maintained that footage of a minor. Given that one of Prescott's victims in Alabama was under 17 years old, he was originally charged with that production and attempted production of child sexual abuse materials, alongside multiple counts of indecent recording and attempted indecent recording. He accepted a plea agreement and pled guilty to only 2 counts of indecent recording. The balance of the charges against him were dismissed as a result of the plea agreement. Just a few short weeks ago, Prescott was sentenced to a 4.5-year carceral term which he'll serve at the disciplinary barracks in Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. He also got busted down from E8 to E1, and I imagine there's a discharge associated with all of this, but I haven't seen any other details about that. After he serves his sentence at Leavenworth, he'll be required to register as a sex offender. A prosecutor with the Army's Office of Special Trial Counsel, that's counsel detailed to handle sensitive cases like this involving sex crimes, murder, domestic violence, and child abuse, called Prescott's behavior an egregious violation of trust and privacy. She said that she hoped the sentence offered Prescott's victims some sense of closure, and that the outcome demonstrated that military justice will penetrate the rank of the offender in order to seek justice. And I think that's a really interesting and valid perspective. But I also think that in order for that message to really stick, it might help the OSTC mission to keep the case visible. There are a handful of articles about this case available on journalist websites that are separate from the Department of Defense, and it's very evident that there used to be an article on Army.mil that discussed this very case. But that article has been pulled down, and a direct link produces only error messages. I'm including the erroneous link in the show notes, and if it works for you, or if you find an alternate link that does, please let me know. But as it stands, I have to say that pulling the article from Army.mil doesn't feel great. It feels like instead of circulating the information to people who may have legitimately been impacted by it, been victims of Prescott, in any of those 14 years worth of duty station locations, instead of any of that, the incident is being swept under the rug. And the thing is, I don't know that there's that much space under the rug. More than a decade ago, in 2013, Army Sergeant First Class Michael McClendon served as a staff advisor at West Point. There, he was generally responsible for the health, welfare, and discipline of 125 cadets, which I am probably erroneously interpreting as like a West Point house mom. Sergeant McClendon was a decorated Iraq War vet who entered the service in 1990 and was assigned to West Point in 2009. He had trained as a combat engineer, and by the time he arrived on campus, he had been awarded a Bronze Star. In his free time, so that's time that he wasn't dedicated to the health, welfare, and discipline of those 125 cadets, he surreptitiously filmed female cadets in the shower. The internet, being the internet, hypothesized that what no one was asking was whether the dozen female cadets consented to being filmed because, and I quote, "We live in an age when young women allow men to take naked pictures of them all of the time." And they wondered if it was possible that the women denied consenting to the filming in order to avoid reprimands. And these were the comments of a law firm. The women hadn't stormed the parapets of the New York Times and released this article on their own. The Army reached out to the women they were able to identify in the videos in order to let them know about the invasion of their privacy. And yeah, that phrase feels really insufficient right here. I feel like an invasion of privacy is when I get those, "Oops, sorry, the hospital record was hacked and your social security number may or may not have been compromised, so here's your free credit monitoring notice." This feels entirely too intimate to be described as an invasion of privacy, but I was recently reprimanded by a sister-in-law for invading their privacy by sending mail to their new address, so maybe I'm not an authority on the subject. Whether or not I am able to properly identify the outer bounds of an invasion of privacy, the notifications to these women came on the heels of 15 months of investigation into what was going on at West Point. The videos were taken in the showers or bathrooms, but some were taken elsewhere on campus. The New York Times also reported that documents in the case indicated that in some instances, McClendon entered the women's bathroom and shower areas without knocking. And while that seems related, it does seem separate from the use of a camera in those facilities. It feels more similar to walking into the backstage area of a beauty pageant unannounced to gawp at children, teens, and young adults in the nude. I guess to the Army's credit, the women in the recordings were offered support and counseling. It's, of course, unclear if taking the Army up on that support or counseling would have had a negative impact on their promotability later. The Army charged McClendon with dereliction of duty, cruelty and maltreatment, entering a women's bathroom without notice, and taking and possessing inappropriate photos and videos of women. From what I can tell, some of those were charged as actions prejudicial to good order and discipline. McClendon pled guilty in his court-martial, and pursuant to his plea agreement was sentenced to 33 months confinement, reduction to E1, and a bad conduct discharge. He petitioned the Court of Appeals for the Armed Forces for review in September 2015, and was denied that review in November 2015. But I've not found any Army Court of Criminal Appeals opinions on his matter, even after combing the ACCA site and Lexis. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed today's episode, please share it. I invite you to submit case suggestions and feedback to conductunbecomingpod@gmail.com or on conductunbecomingpod.com. Join me next time and we'll stick in this 2013-2014 era and continue on the path of cases that may have contributed to the creation of the Office of Special Trial Counsel. Until then, take care. Conduct Unbecoming is a podcast where I get to talk about interesting crimes and cases that involve U.S. military service members. I research, write, and produce the podcast myself. The opinions expressed are my own, and perhaps it's obvious. Conduct Unbecoming is not approved, authorized, or endorsed by the Department of Defense, or by their new preferred name, the Department of War.